right now we're going to move to the interview section of Political Payne. This week, my guest this is really interesting, guys. Here on the Central Coast in Santa Barbara County, we have a federal penitentiary, Lompoc Federal Prison. And it's often like you'll hear it referenced in television and film. But it has been, Lompoc, everyone says, but it has been the site of COVID outbreaks. It was very early on in the pandemic. There was a massive COVID outbreak. There were like more than just hundreds and hundreds. It might have been more than 1,000 inmates were infected. There was national news coverage about it. At one point, it had the highest infection rate of any federal penitentiary. And so it was pretty bad out there. They've had 7 inmates die. And in January, they had another outbreak. So many of these people are getting reinfected. Okay. And this is something where you only see organization around treatment of inmates like human beings. You only see organizing around that on the left, right? Organizing against the death penalty, organizing against solitary confinement. Some on the right claim to be for criminal justice or prison reform. I don't see that much of it, right? Trump reinstated the death penalty. He expanded private prisons to hold these children that he was stripping from parents at the border. So the police state always does well under the right, and the Democrats aren't much better on the matter. But the guest I have this week is with the chair of the Lompoc Prison Task Force, and they've organized an event. We're going to talk about it in the interview, but just so you know, it's this Sunday at right around 1, but you should get there at 12:30 or 12:45 in the afternoon. That is at Ryon Park in Lompoc. That's Lompoc, California. If you're nearby, I'm going to try to clip this one by Saturday so everybody can share this if they want. But they're going to have an event to just kind of raise awareness that the inmates there are still going through hell. They are still getting infected with COVID, and there's all kinds of systemic issues go along with that. And my guest is going to talk about them. So without further ado, here is the interview this week for Political Payne. Patricia Solorio with the Lompoc Prison Task Force. Okay, my guest today on Political Payne is Patricia Solorio, who is the Associate Director for the Fund for Santa Barbara. And she also chairs the Lompoc Prison Task Force. And the task force is planning an event for this Sunday. That's going to be February 21st, correct? And why don't you tell me a bit about that event? We can, hit that first and then tell me why it's being organized and what's been going on at the prison in regards to COVID-19.
Absolutely. And first, just thank you so much for the time to come in and share with you about the work that the Lompoc Prison Task Force has been doing for a year since COVID, since there was a initial COVID outbreak at the prison last year. A group of community members and family members got together to advocate for the inmates who were just in before times, what I call them.
Me too.
Were not the best conditions to begin with, and with COVID, it just got worse. But for Sunday, the family members, together with community members that make up the Lompoc Task Force, have organized a balloon release, and they are biodegradable balloons. So we are being conscious of the environmental issues, but essentially it's just a way for folks to get together, socially distanced and safe, to show solidarity and support for the inmates and their families as they continue to be incarcerated in inhumane and conditions, and like I said, in the best of times, they are inhumane conditions, and right now they are terrible. And I can get into all of the details of that later, but Sunday, the 21st. We're meeting at folks in Lompoc call it Ryon, and I call it Ryon Park. They're in
Yeah.
Lompoc. It's on Ocean, I believe, and if you get there by like 12:30, 12:45, we're going to have a representative from Salud Carvajal's office and a representative from Joan Hartman's office, in addition to a family member and a community member who will speak, and we'll do the balloon release as a signal to them. So the inmates get, media, right? They get the information. So every time we had an action, last year we had 2 car caravans that were really successful. One made national news, NPR carried it, and but there was hundreds of people that showed up, and it was a car caravan. So we just drove up and down the frontage road there in front of the federal prison, and honked our horns and held up signs, and the inmates heard us, and it gives them hope. It gives them hope, and just to know that there are people on the outside that care about how they're being treated, regardless of whether they're incarcerated justly or unjustly, because we know that there are, both of those scenarios happening. But incarceration shouldn't mean a death sentence, and 7 inmates have died due to COVID that were not sentenced to death by a judge and jury. So that is significant, and that is just here in Lompoc. We know that across the nation, in counties, state, and federal holding facilities, and detention centers where folks are being held unjustly, in my opinion, are suffering under normal conditions, what we would call normal conditions, and now with COVID, just completely inhumane conditions.
Yes, and so the Lompoc prison it's a federal prison. It was like an epicenter, I don't know if you call it a super spreader. It was an epicenter for COVID-19 in Santa Barbara County very early on in the pandemic. I seem to remember, once the first wave of lockdowns and strictures were happening, there was some effort by some local representatives, I think some county supervisors, maybe an assembly member. I don't want to use names because I can't remember for sure everybody, who was, they were trying to get the Lompoc Federal Prison removed from the state's, accounting of our area. Because I think it was like hundreds of inmates were infected. Like you said, by now 7 have died, and it's a real problem. And so and
what we know, right? What we know is that didn't help, right? Regardless of whether you try to separate, they are in our community. The COs, the correctional officers, work there, and they live in our community. They live in Santa Maria. They live in Lompoc. They live in Santa Barbara, Buellton, so they live in our community. And what we know is that the inmates didn't bring COVID to the community.
Of course,
the community brought COVID to the inmates, and it is the federal government's charge to take care of these humans that are incarcerated. And what we did, what this community did, and what the federal prison did, is they took COVID to the inmates. And then we turn it around and say, oh, well, they're getting sick and they're bringing it to our community. But regardless of whether they excluded those numbers, it didn't make any difference in our community, because it was, it was going to spread as it did, because I just for a array of reasons that I don't want to get into about the former administration and leaving, and that happened. But the bottom line is that they are in the care of the federal government, and indirectly of each and every one of us, right?
Of course.
government. So,
Well,
anyways,
I just remember the disingenuousness of that argument because clearly, prison guards are part of the community. They go out into the community,
yeah,
and I was just looking at a USA Today, national news story that came out in July about how a inmate who was infected was not isolated, and that prison guards who were symptomatic were not didn't stop working. They kept working. So obviously, this is how COVID was spread. It was obviously, I mean, I was speaking out then about how cavalier the administration was being, the federal administration, the Trump administration,
yeah,
about how they were handling the virus. When people were coming in, I can't remember if it was off of the cruise ship or when people were
oh
flying
yeah. I
in
mean,
from China, they didn't suit up the HHS employees correctly. Were trying to be super casual about it. So it was this kind of cavalier attitude that created the spread. And like you said, these people are under federal
yeah,
care, or they're federal,
yeah.
they're imprisoned, of course, but it's the
Mhm.
federal government's responsibility to provide a safe environment for them. And now, as we know, and I'm glad you guys are doing this event now, we've had another outbreak in
Right.
January. What can you tell me about that?
Well, you know, sadly, not very many lessons learned. I think that COs, there have been reportings of COs being required to show up to work if they're not showing symptoms but they've tested positive. So I understand that COs are put in an awkward position, like they need their job, but there's also there just seems to be a lot of, I mean, you call it cavalier, I call it just ineptitude,
Callousness.
and yeah, really being callous and and not, it's just not caring at all for even themselves or their community, never mind the inmates, right? I mean, if they cared about their family members, their community, that would be enough for them to behave in a different way. So no lessons learned. There continues to be reports of either not enough availability of PPE, not enough availability of just cleaning solutions, COs not wearing masks, and granted, some of the inmates are not wearing masks, but at this point, if people who are in a position of power are not modeling it, demonstrating, then why should they care? They've all gotten sick. I think the majority of the inmates have been infected, and there's been reinfections.
Oh, geez.
So, and what happens is that the inmates, when they're infected, and this happened in the first one, and I believe this was happening now, is that they put them in isolation, and and sometimes it's 14 days, and sometimes it's 28 days. And they, there was like faulty like plumbing, where they're having to take what they call bird baths from the toilet to be able to bathe because they weren't letting them out to shower. I think they were getting like 45 minutes to go to, eat, to bathe, to try and get access to a phone. At one point, all communication was cut off, even letter writing. And
Wow.
we of course brought this to the attention of the BOP, Bureau of Prisons, and Senator Carvajal's office, who's been very helpful. Congressman Carvajal's office has been very responsive. We've had a meeting with him, but I think that there's been 5 wardens since last year around this time. I think we're on number 5.
What?
In a year. And so there's just constant turnover of leadership. And so there's a lack of leadership. There really isn't consistency in messaging, or so they can't hold on to a warden for, I mean, I think it's been like every 3 months has been the maximum. And the current warden their last day is going to be on the 27th, and a new warden is coming in, and they're doing a transition, which I think is an improvement on past turnovers, where I think that there's been much transition at all. But when there's this lack of leadership, there's no consistency in directing people, and that brings me to the point that they can't even have full staff. They don't. They had a dentist doing, playing doctor. Not the dentists aren't doctors, but they're not medical doctors, and they had a dentist in there seeing patients because they don't have a full medical staff. They built that field hospital there. It didn't really use it. It was more for show, during the height of the crisis last year. And, it's just that there doesn't seem to be many lessons learned, and they continue to just be callous and cavalier, in my opinion.
Wow. Well, and I've said this before, I think COVID has kind of peeled back a lot of layers in our society and just revealed the inequality and the systemic problems were always there, but this crisis has kind of laid them all bare. And just all these issues you're talking about with the prison population, or sorry, with the prison system, the federal system, this turnover of wardens and the lack of PPE and not even following protocols. It really illustrates like what kind of dire straits they're in over there. So again, want to reiterate, this is Sunday. You said people can arrive around 12:30, 12:45, the noon hour at Ryon Park in Lompoc.
Yes.
A lot of people, you will hear the Lompoc Penitentiary referenced in movies and TV shows, and they'll always say Lompoc, he spent some time up in Lompoc, right? But it's going to be in that city in Lompoc.
Yes.
Outside of showing up to the balloon event and being there to show their respects, what else can people do to help out with the Lompoc Prison Task Force?
I mean, just as always, I think that, and I know that sometimes for folks, it might be hard to advocate for inmates, right? But regardless of what they are convicted for, and they're doing their time, that's they're agreeing to, or they're there, right? They have no choice. They're doing their time. They were convicted, justly or unjustly, but it is incumbent on each one of us as citizens and, community members that they are our neighbors, regardless of whether we see them every day. And some of them we do because they go out and work in our community, just FYI.
Yeah.
Without testing. So, yeah. So, they in the minimum, I don't know all the lingo, the minimum security area, they do go out into the community and work. So they are our neighbors, they are humans, and we need to stand up and advocate for the most vulnerable, and they are one of the most vulnerable populations. I would like for people to pick up the phone and call their congressman. Now, this is a federal issue, so wherever you are, you can call your congressman and encourage them to, if they're not in Salud Carvajal's district, they can pick up their phone and call their congressman and say, hey, I want you to call Salud Carvajal and work with him to address this issue. We're pushing for a hearing from the Judicial Committee in Congress, and we hope to get an audience with them. They need to hear these stories firsthand of the family members, because it's not just the inmates that are suffering. These are, they are sons, they are fathers, they are brothers, and their loved ones are suffering through this with them. And it is inhumane. So right now, making sure that we rattle those cages, and continue to do that. That is helpful.
Very good. And so if people are interested in getting involved with the task force, would they reach out to the Fund for Santa Barbara?
Yeah, they can reach out to me directly. My email is last name Solorio, Solorio, at fundforsantabarbara.org. And I'd be happy to direct you. So we don't have an open group. We do ask that people fill out a form, so we get to know who is joining our group. As you can imagine, there are family members who are in our group, and we have to know who's in the room. There's retaliation internally in the prison is real, and we need to make sure to protect family members and inmates.
My goodness.
Yeah.
Well, it's important work y'all are doing. I appreciate that you're doing it. Thank you for coming on the show today. It's Patricia Solorio, Associate Director for the Fund for Santa Barbara and Chair for the Lompoc Prison Task Force. Thanks for joining me today for the show, Patricia.
Thanks, Joe. I really appreciate the time. Take care.
You too. All right,
Okay.
guys. That was the interview with Patricia Solorio. She's quite involved locally here with the Fund for Santa Barbara. So just insane what's going on at the Lompoc Penitentiary, the federal penitentiary that we have in our area. It's the other thing she didn't get to that she wish she had, she mentioned it after the stream, was that the Lompoc Penitentiary is a Superfund site. And a Superfund site that's quite a euphemistic term for a toxic waste dump. And Superfunds are usually like the toxic waste dumps of toxic waste dumps. So it's right near Vandenberg Air Force Base. So they actually dump some of the waste from Vandenberg Air Force Base there. Kind of messed up when you think about it. That's just a little bit about that. Here it is. Here's a photo. The Lompoc, USP Lompoc, United States Penitentiary Lompoc. It's medium security U.S. penitentiary with an adjacent minimum security satellite camp. So again, there was a massive COVID outbreak when COVID first started, and they just had another outbreak. And I just think it's insane what Patricia said about there have been 5 wardens within the past year or two, or whatever she said. Like literally, wardens will just last a few months with hardly any transition between them. So that's what's going on. That's what's going on out there in Lompoc with the penitentiary. Really messed up stuff. So